To see who is the most qualified to be a guide dog, the woman calls all the dogs over. All the dogs rushed over to her. Only one puppy was too dumb to react. Finally, it froze for a few seconds before it ran over to the dog. Then it lifted its head and sat down on the ground. He looked at his master as if to ask why you called me here. But this stupid little dog was chosen as the most qualified guide dog because he was calm and collected, the qualities of a guide dog. So Little Q left his first owner and was shipped to a guide dog training center. But the trainer didn't rush to train Little Q. Instead, she found him an adoptive home. This is because guide dogs need to be loved in their childhood to be able to trust humans in their future endeavors. Little Q has had a very happy childhood here. He had a small yard to himself and slept every day after eating his fill. But a year passed quickly. Although he was still immature, he felt a great deal of love in his foster home. That night, snowflakes suddenly fell from the sky. The day of parting came. The next day, they took a long walk along the cherry trees. The foster parents told Little Q to come back often when the cherry blossoms are in bloom. At last, Little Q was put on a car. Parting is always painful. Looking at Little Q in the car, the foster parents were going to watch him leave, but as the car was moving away, they couldn't resist chasing after it. They didn't stop until the intersection. They waved their hands, knowing that Little Q had bigger things to do. This was the second time that Little Q had experienced a parting. He was sent to a guide dog training center, but on his first day, he didn't fit in. He's used to the food at home, but he's not used to the dog food here, so he kicked the pot out in disgust. But there's no one here to spoil him. Little Q's stomach growled all night, so the next day during training, he ate everything in sight. The trainer was in tears at this scene and unanimously decided that he couldn't resist the temptation of food, and in the obedience training afterward. All the other dogs are very obedient, but only Little Q lazy sitting on the ground who do not want to move. Fortunately, the trainer did not give up. He began to encourage and educate, touching the birthmark on Little Q's belly and saying that he was the most different dog he had ever seen. As soon as he said that, Little Q stood up. In this way, under the trainer's slow guidance, Little Q also began to cooperate with the. After a few days of training, the trainer thought Little Q was just an ordinary dog, until one day, he had something to do and asked Little Q to stay where he was. And so, Little Q waited on the ground for a long time, so long that the trainer forgot about it and started to train other dogs before he noticed it by accident. He gazed at Little Q in disbelief. He didn't realize that it was born with the necessary qualities of a guide dog. Overcoming its nature and suppressing its desires is something even a human being would find hard to do. What he didn't expect was that Little Q had an exceptionally strong memory too. During road training, he could easily memorize steps and corners of intersections. When the trainer kept talking about various obstacles, Little Q even started to get sleepy. No matter how complicated the environment is, it's not hard for him to remember, and the trainer grows more and more fond of him. Soon the training center is ready for the guide dog test. As the signal gun is suddenly fired, the dogs start to panic. Those who ran away were too sensitive to sound, and those who kept barking were too excited. But only Little Q sat calmly where he was. He was the first to be qualified to be a guide dog. Perhaps it was fate. That day, they saw a blind man during training. The trainer rushed after him with Little Q, wanting him to try walking with a guide dog. But the man was a stubborn old man who didn't believe that a dog could lead the way, until the trainer assured him that the guide dog could reach him in 10 minutes on a 30-minute walk. Only then did the man carefully pick up the saddle and try it. But at first, they don't get along. The man was afraid of dogs and didn't dare to admit it. He walked very stiffly. When he came to the corner, he had to double-check and didn't trust Little Q's instructions. When he got to a familiar road, he became cocky again. The trucks passing by scared him into a cold sweat. Despite the many twists and turns on the road, they arrived at their destination within 10 minutes. The man also had a new understanding of guide dogs, so he wanted to keep Little Q with him. But to apply for a guide dog, you need to complete tacit understanding training. It's not only practical, but also theoretical. This can be difficult for the man and the dog who both like to doze off. That day the man suddenly felt unwell, so he got up and walked towards the toilet. Although he didn't call Little Q to come over, he noticed something was wrong at a glance in the corner. Sure enough, when he walked in, he saw his master vomiting into the toilet. Little Q was so anxious that he couldn't stop looking at him. The man was sick. He was taken to the hospital and his arm was full of flowing tubes. Little Q didn't know what kind of disease his master was suffering from, so he could only stay by his side day and night, since there was no one here to take care of Little Q. The trainer came to the hospital and tried to take him away. The son couldn't bear to see his sick father suffer from the pain of parting again, so he quietly took little Q away while he was sleeping. Unbeknownst to them, a hand slowly reached out from behind them. He waved his hand gently, as if to say goodbye. Little Q, who hadn't gone far, seemed to sense something. It turned around and stood there for a long time. In the 3 years since then, the man hasn't come to pick him up. Little Q didn't look for a new owner and started to work as a demonstration dog, until one day he suddenly heard a familiar sound. It was the sound of a cane hitting the ground. Little Q rushed out excitedly. Sure enough, it was his master returning. He wagged his tail and fell into the man's arms. The dog and the man are enjoying the reunion, but the man wasn't there to pick him up. They went to the training ground and walked for 30 meters, just like they did during the training. Then he told Little Q to stop. The man says that's enough. This was the last time Little Q walked with him. He knew he was dying and came to say goodbye to Little Q that day. Soon after, the man died. At the memorial service, Little Q also came, looking at the body in the coffin. He wondered why his master slept here, why there were white flowers all around, why the people who were just complaining about his death suddenly shed tears in silence. On the way back to the training center, when they pass a step, Little Q still stops in front of the step. He reminded the trainer to pay attention to the steps. Little Q was really an excellent guide dog, so gentle and quiet throughout his life. 7 years passed in a flash. At the age of 11, Little Q retired from the guide dog center and was sent back to his foster parents' home. He kept sniffing the scent of his home. Everything was still so familiar, but he has grown old. The steps he used to be able to jump down casually, now he needs to be carried by his foster father to get down. It has gone through a lifetime of running to kind people, and it ended up in the same place it grew up. So Little Q is undoubtedly lucky. He lived happily here for another year, until one day, while walking up a flight of steps, he fell to the ground without standing still. He had spent his whole life reminding people to watch out for the steps, but in the end, he fell in front of them. Little Q was too old to stand up. The fall was fatal for him at his age. The doctors couldn't do anything about it, so they had to see how long he could hold on, until one night, the foster parents heard him breathing rapidly. They came to Little Q's side, gently stroked his fur, and comforted him by saying that he had worked hard.